I'm 66 years old and I have faced hurricanes, military deployments, and the quiet loneliness that follows losing the love of your life. But nothing prepared me for the moment a 4-star general rose from his chair the instant I walked into the room. Not a polite nod, not a formal military greeting. He stood so abruptly that the leather chair behind him rolled backward across the polished floor. Every officer in the room immediately fell silent. Colonels, captains, senior civilians. Even my former commander Richard Lawson looked unusually tense. The general walked toward me without saying a word. For one terrifying second I wondered if I'd accidentally wandered into a classified meeting. Maybe someone had made a mistake. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be there. I almost apologized and stepped back toward the door. Instead, the general stopped less than 3 feet in front of me. His blue eyes looked strangely emotional. He slowly raised his right hand. Not to salute, to shake mine. His hand trembled. "So," he said quietly, "I've finally found you." I blinked. "I'm sorry, sir." He smiled through eyes that looked suspiciously wet. For over 20 years, he whispered, "I've wanted to thank the woman who saved my life." The room became perfectly still. I honestly thought he had mistaken me for someone else. I had never met this man. I would have remembered meeting a 4-star general. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," I said. "I don't believe we've ever met." He nodded gently. "No, ma'am. We haven't." He took a slow breath. "But you still saved me." My heart began pounding. Saved him? How? When? Before I could ask another question, he looked toward Commander Lawson. "I think," he said softly, "Mrs. Carter deserves to hear the whole story. That was the moment my ordinary life disappeared forever. But to understand why a man I'd never met believed I had saved his life, I need to take you back 3 days. My name is Margaret Carter. I retired from the Navy Reserve 15 years ago after serving nearly 3 decades as a medical logistics specialist. I never considered myself a hero. Heroes were the men and women who boarded helicopters under fire or ran toward explosions. People like me simply kept things moving. We filled shortages, solved problems, answered phones, did the jobs that rarely appeared in history books. These days my mornings were wonderfully predictable. I usually woke before sunrise. Old military habits never really disappear. I'd brew a pot of coffee, carry my favorite blue mug onto the back porch of my small house outside Norfolk, Virginia, and watch the neighborhood slowly wake up. Some mornings I'd hear children waiting for school buses. Other mornings it was nothing but birds and distant traffic. After my husband Tom passed away 8 years earlier, I'd learned to appreciate quiet. Not because I stopped missing him. I never would. But silence eventually stopped feeling lonely. Sometimes it even felt peaceful. Every Tuesday and Thursday I volunteered at a nearby veterans hospital. Mostly simple things. Helping visitors find patient rooms. Delivering flowers. Restocking waiting areas. Listening when someone needed another human being for 5 minutes. Life wasn't exciting. It was steady. And after everything Tom and I had experienced together, steady felt like a blessing. There was only one unusual part of my routine. Every couple of months, sometimes a little sooner, my phone would ring. The caller ID always came from the Regional Military Blood Program. My blood type was exceptionally rare. Years earlier, while I was still serving doctors, had asked whether I'd be willing to remain on an emergency donor list. I never hesitated. Whenever they called, I went. Didn't matter if it was raining. Didn't matter if it was Thanksgiving. Didn't matter if I had other plans. If someone needed blood, they probably didn't have time for excuses. The process never changed. They called. I drove. I donated. I went home. Federal privacy laws meant I never learned who received it. And honestly, after enough years, I stopped wondering. I simply assumed somewhere out there was another stranger trying to stay alive. That was enough for me. Tom used to tease me every time I came home wearing the little white bandage on my arm. "There goes my favorite vampire," he'd joke. I'd roll my eyes. "You know that's not how vampires work." "I know." He'd grin. "But if somebody keeps asking for your blood, I'm allowed one bad joke." I still smiled whenever I remembered that. On the Tuesday, everything changed. I was trimming roses near the front porch when my phone rang. The screen showed a name I hadn't seen in years. Commander Richard Lawson. Even after retirement, seeing his name instantly straightened my posture. I answered on the second ring. "Good morning, sir." A familiar chuckle came through the speaker. "Margaret, you've been retired almost as long as some of my junior officers have been alive." "I know." "You can stop calling me sir." "I probably won't." I figured. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Something felt different. Richard had always been calm. Today he sounded careful. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I need you back on base Friday morning." I frowned. "What for?" "I can't explain over the phone." That immediately caught my attention. "Is something wrong?" "No." "Then what's this about?" "I promise you'll understand soon." I laughed softly. "Richard, that's exactly the kind of answer that makes people nervous." "I know." "Can you at least give me a hint?" A pause. Then another. "I'm sorry." "I really can't." When the call ended, I stood in my front yard holding pruning shears in one hand and my silent phone in the other. For the first time in years, I felt that old military sensation creeping back. The one that whispered something unexpected was waiting. Something important. Something that could change everything. I had absolutely no idea how true that feeling would become. By Friday morning, I found myself driving through the familiar gates of Naval Station Norfolk with more questions than answers. I had no way of knowing that before lunchtime I would discover that every emergency blood donation I'd quietly made over 2 decades had been connected by one invisible thread. And that thread was leading me straight toward the most powerful man I would ever meet. By the time I reached the administration building, the rain had started again. Not heavy rain, just that steady Norfolk drizzle that makes everything look gray and serious. The windshield wipers squeaked once before I shut off the engine. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, staring at the building where I'd once spent far too many long afternoons chasing supply forms, medical records, and last-minute readiness reports. 15 years away should have made it feel unfamiliar. It didn't. Military buildings have a way of holding on to you. The same polished floors. The same posted notices. The same smell of coffee paper and floor wax. A young lieutenant was waiting just inside the entrance when I walked in. He couldn't have been more than 26, maybe 27. His uniform was perfect, his expression polite, and he looked at me with the kind of careful respect young officers give older people when they aren't quite sure who they're dealing with. "Mrs. Carter." "That's me." "Commander Lawson asked me to escort you upstairs." "Did he tell you why?" The lieutenant's face barely changed, but I saw the tiniest flicker in his eyes. "No, ma'am." That was when my stomach tightened. Young officers are not great liars. They usually think they are, but they aren't. I followed him through the building. Several people glanced at me as we passed. A few nodded. One senior chief actually stepped aside and said, "Good morning, ma'am," in a tone that felt too formal for a retired woman in a raincoat. I didn't like it. Not because anyone was rude. Because everyone was too respectful. When you're 66, you learn to recognize when a room knows something you don't. The lieutenant led me to a small waiting area outside a suite of offices. He gestured toward a chair. "Someone will be with you shortly." That's what people say before dental surgery. His mouth twitched. "Yes, ma'am." Then he disappeared down the hallway. I sat alone under fluorescent lights, listening to the faint hum of the building. On the wall across from me hung framed photographs of aircraft carriers, hospital ships, and humanitarian missions. I recognized some of the locations. Others were before or after my time. For a moment I thought about Tom. He would have told me to stop worrying. Then he would have worried twice as much on my behalf. "Margaret!" I turned. Commander Richard Lawson stood in the doorway. Older than I remembered, but still unmistakably himself. His hair had gone from salt and pepper to mostly silver. His shoulders were a little less squared than before, but his eyes were the same. Steady. Kind. Impossible to read when he wanted them that way. I stood. "Richard!" He smiled. "You look well." "You look like you're hiding something." "That too." I folded my arms. "Are you going to tell me what's happening now?" "Not here." "That is not comforting." "I know." He walked closer and lowered his voice. "Margaret, I need you to trust me for about 10 more minutes. I trusted you through 2 hurricane supply runs and 3 budget audits. I'm not sure how much trust you have left." That made him laugh, but the laugh faded quickly. Then his expression changed, softened, almost emotional. "I've waited a very long time to see this happen." A chill moved through me. "See what happened?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at my hands. I realized I was twisting my wedding ring. I still wore it, never saw much reason to stop. Richard noticed, but he was kind enough not to mention it. "Come with me," he said. We walked down a corridor I didn't recognize. That bothered me too. I knew this building, or at least I used to, but this section had been renovated. The hallway was quieter. The doors were heavier. The people we passed were older, higher-ranking, and far too aware of us. At the end of the corridor stood a pair of dark wooden doors. A Marine stood outside. The sight of him made me stop walking. "Richard." He turned. "What?" Am I about to meet someone important? He considered lying, then apparently thought better of it. Yes, how important? He looked at the doors. 4 stars. For a second I genuinely thought I had misheard him. Excuse me, he's waiting for you. My mouth went dry. Why would a 4-star general be waiting for me? Richard's eyes softened again. You'll understand in a minute. The Marine opened the doors. I stepped inside. The room was larger than I expected, with a long conference table, polished wood flags along one wall, and enough brass in one place to make any retired reservist stand straighter without thinking. Several officers turned toward me. Then the man at the far end of the table stood. That was General Daniel Whitaker. I knew his name. Everyone did. Even civilians knew his face from news briefings, overseas operations, disaster response missions, and congressional hearings. He was the kind of officer people discussed with respect, even when they disagreed with him. And he was looking at me like I was the person he'd been waiting for all morning. He walked around the table. I remember thinking his steps were slower than expected, deliberate, controlled, but his face was not controlled, not completely. There was emotion there, real emotion. He stopped in front of me and took my hand in both of his. That startled me. Military handshakes are usually firm, brief, and professional. This one was different. Personal. Mrs. Carter, he said. Yes, sir. I am Daniel Whitaker. I know who you are, sir. A faint smile appeared. Then you already know one thing about me. I didn't know how to respond. He seemed to understand. What you don't know, he continued, is that 23 years ago I was not a general. He guided me gently toward a chair near the head of the table. Please sit. I sat because my legs were beginning to feel unreliable. He sat beside me, not across from me. That small choice told me more than his words did. This wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't a briefing. It was a confession. He opened a folder on the table. Inside were old documents. Medical records, donation logs, dates, locations. Some pages had been copied so many times the print looked faded. I was a lieutenant colonel, he said, assigned overseas during a joint operation. His voice was quiet now. The convoy I was traveling with was hit. No one in the room moved. I had heard many combat stories in my life, and the older I got, the more I respected the people who told them simply. No drama, no decoration, just facts, because the facts were hard enough. The injuries were severe, he said. By the time they got me to surgery, I'd lost more blood than the doctors believed I could survive. He turned one page. My blood type is extremely rare. I looked down at the records. Then I saw my name. Margaret Ellen Carter. My breath caught. He pointed to a date. This donation reached the surgical team during the first emergency procedure. Another page. This one was used during complications 3 days later. Another page. And this one helped during the final corrective surgery. I stared at the dates. They were familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I remembered the era. I remembered being called in often. I remembered Tom driving me once because I had donated late after a 12-hour shift, and he didn't want me getting behind the wheel. But I had never known the patient. You mean, my voice sounded thin. Those were for you, General Whitaker nodded. Yes, ma'am. I looked at the documents again. 3 donations. 1 month. 1 man. I had thought they were separate emergencies. Separate strangers. Separate moments that ended when the bandage came off my arm. The general reached into the folder and removed a photograph. A young woman stood on a porch holding 2 children. Her face carried the exhausted courage of someone trying not to fall apart. My wife Patricia, he said softly, and our children. I took the photograph with both hands. The children were so small. A boy missing his front teeth. A little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit. They were told to prepare for the possibility that I would not come home. My throat tightened. The general's voice grew rough. Your blood gave me time. Time for surgery, time for recovery, time to come back to them. For several seconds I couldn't speak. All those years I had thought of blood donation as simple service. A chair, a needle, a cookie afterward. Go home, make dinner, forget about it. But now a whole family was staring back at me from a photograph. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. A life that could have ended had continued. And somehow, without knowing it, I had been part of that continuation. General Whitaker looked directly at me. You never asked who the blood was for. I shook my head. I wasn't supposed to. Most people would have wondered. I did wonder. Then why didn't you ask? I looked again at the photograph. Because if someone needed it that badly, that was enough. The general closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they shone. That answer is exactly why I needed to meet you. Then he rested one hand on the folder. But this meeting is not only about gratitude. Commander Lawson shifted slightly beside me. I turned toward him, then back to the general. What else could it be about? The general's expression changed. The warmth remained, but something firmer settled beneath it. Because someone recently suggested, he said, that what you gave for all those years wasn't worth much. My stomach tightened. Before I could stop myself, I thought of one person. My son-in-law Kevin. And suddenly I understood that this story was no longer only about a life I had unknowingly saved. It was about the value of quiet service, and about the people who mistake silence for weakness. For a few seconds after General Whitaker said those words, I could hear nothing but the low hum of the air conditioning. Someone recently suggested that what you gave for all those years wasn't worth much. There are sentences that don't sound loud when they're spoken, but somehow they land like a door slamming shut. I looked down at the old donation records on the table. My name appeared beside dates I barely remembered. Dates when I had probably been tired. Dates when I had probably gone straight from work. Dates when Tom had probably waited up with soup or a blanket pretending not to worry. Not worth much. I had heard similar words before. Not from strangers. Strangers usually thanked me when they learned I donated blood. No, the words that sting deepest almost always come from someone sitting at your own dinner table. I folded my hands in my lap. General, I said carefully, if this has to do with my family, I'm embarrassed that it reached your office. His face softened. Mrs. Carter, you have nothing to be embarrassed about. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness. His voice became firmer. It's fact. Commander Lawson leaned forward slightly. Margaret, you know me well enough to know I wouldn't have brought you here for gossip. I know. Then believe me when I say this matters. I turned back to General Whitaker. What exactly happened? He glanced at one of the officers near the wall. The officer stepped forward and placed another folder in front of him. The general did not open it right away. Instead, he studied me. Before I explain, I want to ask you something. All right. Have you ever told your family what these donations meant? I laughed once, though there was no humor in it. I didn't know what they meant. You knew they helped people. Yes. And how did they respond to that? That was a harder question. I looked toward the window where rain slid in thin lines down the glass. My daughter Susan was always kind about it, I said. She'd remind me to eat afterward. She'd call to check on me. The general nodded. And your son-in-law? There it was. Kevin. Even his name felt heavy in the room. Kevin is... I paused, searching for a fair word. At my age, you learn not to describe people by their worst moment if you can help it. Kevin is practical, I said finally. Commander Lawson raised one eyebrow. I gave him a look. All right, Kevin can be dismissive. The general waited. I sighed. He never understood volunteering. Not really. He believed if something didn't earn money or improve status, it was a poor use of time. No one interrupted. For years, he'd make little comments. I could hear Kevin's voice as clearly as if he were standing there. You're giving away blood again, at least charge them rent. Or, Mom, you're too old to keep playing hero. Or the one that had hurt more than I admitted. You know nobody remembers people like that. I had ignored him most of the time. Older women become experts at ignoring disrespect in order to preserve peace. At Thanksgiving, at birthdays, at family dinners, I'd smile, change the subject, and remind myself that Susan loved him. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just delayed pain. General Whitaker opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, a few written notes, a transcript from a phone conversation or what looked like one. He slid the first page toward me. This was sent to the Public Affairs Office after invitations went out for the donor recognition ceremony. I frowned. What recognition ceremony? Commander Lawson looked almost apologetic. We were going to tell you today. I stared at him. You arranged a ceremony before asking me. Yes. Richard. In my defense, he said, we all knew you would say no. Because I would have. Exactly. Despite myself, I almost smiled. The general tapped the page gently. Your family received early notice because we wanted them present. We believed they should see you honored. I looked down. The email came from Kevin. My mouth went dry before I even finished the first sentence. To whom it may concern. I am writing on behalf of Margaret Carter's family regarding the upcoming recognition event. At first it sounded formal. Then it changed. Kevin had asked whether the recognition included monetary compensation, media exposure, or professional opportunities. He wanted clarification about family participation, and whether relatives could be featured in interviews. My face burned. I had not felt that kind of shame in years. Not shame for myself. Shame for being connected to behavior so small. "I am sorry," I whispered. General Whitaker's voice hardened. "Please don't apologize." I kept reading. Then I reached the part that made my hands go still. "While Margaret's contributions may have sentimental value, our family wants to ensure the event is handled in a way that creates tangible benefit instead of symbolic appreciation only." Symbolic appreciation only. I heard the words in my head cold and polished. I could almost see Kevin typing them in his home office, probably proud of how reasonable he sounded. Commander Lawson quietly said my name. "Margaret." I looked up. "I'm fine." I wasn't. The general slid another page forward. "This one was not sent to us directly. It was forwarded by your granddaughter, Emily." I looked at him sharply. Emily, she was concerned. Emily was 23, newly married, kind-hearted, and far wiser than many of the adults around her. I took the page. It was a screenshot from a family group chat. Kevin had written, "People are acting like Margaret stormed a beach. She donated blood. Good deed, sure, but let's not pretend this is some legendary military service." Below it, someone had added a laughing emoji. Another relative wrote, "Maybe the Navy just needs a nice old lady for publicity." My eyes stung. I hated that. At 66, tears come more easily than they used to, but dignity matters more too. I set the paper down carefully. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I refused to let my hands shake in front of a room full of officers. General Whitaker's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Carter, when I read those words, I saw my wife's face in a hospital waiting room." The room went silent. I saw my children being told their father might not survive. His voice lowered. "And I saw someone reducing the act that helped keep me alive to a publicity detail." I swallowed. I never wanted any of this to become family conflict. "You didn't create the conflict." "No, but Susan will be caught in the middle." That was the truth that hurt most. My daughter Susan had spent years trying to keep everyone comfortable. She loved me. She loved Kevin. And because of that, she often softened his sharp edges instead of confronting them. The general leaned back. "What would you like to happen?" That surprised me. "I thought you were telling me what was going to happen." He smiled faintly. "I'm a General Mrs. Carter, not in your family." For the first time that morning I laughed. Only a little, but enough to breathe again. Then I thought carefully. At 25 I might have wanted an apology shouted across a room. At 40 I might have wanted someone to pay. At 66 revenge has a different shape. I didn't want Kevin destroyed. I didn't want Susan humiliated. I didn't want Emily forced to choose sides. I wanted the truth placed gently but firmly where no one could step around it. "I want them to understand," I said. General Whitaker studied me. "That's all?" "No." I looked down at the photograph of his wife and children. "I want them to understand without me having to beg for respect." His expression changed. He understood that. Every older person does. There comes a point in life when you grow tired of explaining why your quiet sacrifices mattered. Commander Lawson finally spoke. "The ceremony is tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" "Yes. You were really planning to spring that on me." He gave me a guilty smile. "Technically, yes." I closed my eyes. "Military men never change." The general smiled. "We would like your family to attend." "They already received invitations." "Yes." "And Kevin?" "Yes." I thought about that. Kevin sitting there comfortable in his assumptions. Kevin thinking this was a small courtesy ceremony for an old woman. Kevin believing public recognition only mattered if it could be turned into money status or advantage. Then I thought about General Whitaker standing in front of him. Not angry, not cruel, just truthful. That was a kind of justice I could accept. The general's voice softened. "Mrs. Carter, I will not embarrass your family for sport." "I know. But I will not allow anyone in that room to misunderstand what anonymous service can mean." I looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not at the stars on his uniform. Not at the power he carried. At the man who had lived 23 extra years because strangers answered emergency calls. "All right," I said. "All right." I nodded. "I'll come." Commander Lawson exhaled like he'd been holding his breath. The general smiled. "Good." Then he closed the folder. "But there is one more thing." Of course there was. I looked at him wearily. Should I be worried? No. His eyes warmed. But Kevin should be. The morning of the ceremony, I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes staring at clothes as if they were going to make the decision for me. There are few things more ridiculous than a 66-year-old woman being intimidated by her own dresses. I finally chose a navy blue suit Tom had always liked. It was plain, well-made, and old enough that I had to brush lint from the shoulders twice before leaving the house. On the dresser sat Tom's photograph. He was wearing a ball cap from a Veterans Day parade, smiling like he'd just said something he shouldn't have. I touched the frame. "I suppose you're enjoying this," I said. Of course he didn't answer. But in my mind I heard him clearly. "Margaret, you survived military inspections. You can survive applause." I wasn't so sure. By 9:30, Commander Lawson had sent a Navy driver to my house, which was both thoughtful and completely unnecessary. I opened the door and found a young petty officer standing on my porch. "Mrs. Carter." "Yes. Commander Lawson sent me, ma'am." Of course he did. The young man looked worried, as though he'd already failed some invisible test. I smiled. "It's all right, I'm coming." The drive to the base was quiet. The sky had cleared after the rain, leaving everything sharp and bright. Wet pavement reflected the morning sun. Flags along the entrance road moved in a light breeze. When we reached the auditorium, I nearly told the driver to circle the block. There were more cars than I expected. Far more. People in uniform were walking toward the entrance. Civilian families, too. A few reporters stood near the front steps with cameras. I sat frozen. The petty officer looked in the rearview mirror. "Ma'am, just taking a moment." He waited. Bless him, he didn't rush me. Finally, I stepped out. Emily saw me before anyone else did. "Grandma," she hurried across the walkway and wrapped me in a hug. At 23, she still hugged with her whole heart the way she had as a little girl when she'd run into my kitchen smelling like crayons and sunshine. "You look beautiful," she said. I looked terrified. Both can be true. That made me laugh. Susan approached more slowly behind her. My daughter looked tired. There were faint shadows under her eyes, and the smile she gave me carried apology before she even spoke. "Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." She hugged me tightly. "Longer than usual." That told me everything. She knew about the emails. Maybe not all of it. Enough. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I rubbed her back once. "Not here." She nodded against my shoulder. Kevin stood a few steps behind her. Gray suit. Polished shoes. Jaw tight. He gave me a short nod. "Margaret." There it was again. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Carter. "Margaret." I nodded back. "Kevin." For once he didn't make a comment. Inside the auditorium, the front rows had been reserved for family and honored guests. Emily sat beside me. Susan sat on her other side. Kevin took the seat next to Susan. I noticed him looking around, measuring the room. He saw the reporters, the senior officers, the medical staff, the veterans in dress jackets. His expression shifted. Just a little. This was not the small courtesy event he had expected. Commander Lawson appeared near the aisle. "You all right?" "No." "Good answer." "Richard, if I pass out, you are not allowed to tell anyone." "Understood." "You look like you're going to tell everyone." "I might tell one person." "Tom." His smile softened. "Only Tom." The ceremony began promptly at 10. A Navy band played the national anthem. Everyone stood. Hands went over hearts. Uniformed service members saluted. I looked around the room and felt something settle inside me. This wasn't about me. That helped. It was about all the people whose names were never said. The donors who answered phones. The nurses who started IV lines. The medics who stayed awake for 30 hours. The spouses who waited. The children who prayed without understanding exactly what they were praying for. Several speakers offered brief remarks about military medicine emergency readiness and the Armed Services Blood Program. I listened politely, though most of it passed over me in a blur. Then General Whitaker rose. The room changed immediately. Not because people feared him, because they respected him. He walked to the podium with no notes. A large screen behind him showed a faded photograph of a younger woman holding 2 small children on a porch. Patricia. The children. My breath caught. General Whitaker let the audience look at it for a moment. Then he began. 23 years ago, my wife was told to prepare herself for the possibility that I would not come home. The auditorium went completely still. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. My children were young enough to believe adults could fix anything but old enough to understand fear. I felt Emily's hand slip into mine. My surgical team did everything medicine and skill could do, he continued. But skill still needs resources. Medicine still needs supply. And sometimes a life depends on whether one stranger is willing to show up for another. Kevin shifted slightly in his chair. I did not look at him. The general continued. My blood type is rare. Compatible donors were difficult to find. Over the course of my emergency treatment and recovery, several anonymous donors provided what my body could no longer provide for itself. He paused. One of them donated again and again. The screen changed. Now it showed a simple image. Not my face. Not yet. Just a scanned donor record with the personal details covered except for dates and the words rare blood type. My throat tightened. She did not know my name, the general said. She did not know my rank. She did not know my family. She did not know whether I would ever recover. His voice grew deeper. She only knew that someone needed help. The room was silent. That woman is here today. The screen changed again. A photograph appeared of me from my service years. I nearly groaned. Emily squeezed my hand harder, clearly delighted. I leaned toward her. "I'm going to have words with Richard." She whispered, "You looked amazing." I looked exhausted. "You looked strong." I had no response to that. General Whitaker turned slightly toward the front row. "Mrs. Margaret Carter, would you please stand?" My body resisted. Every instinct I had told me to remain seated. But Emily was already helping me up, and Susan was crying quietly beside her. So I stood. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the entire auditorium rose with me. All of them. Uniforms rustled. Chairs folded upward. Veterans placed hands over hearts. Doctors and nurses applauded. The sound grew and grew until I felt it in my chest. I looked down because I could not bear all those eyes. Then I accidentally saw Kevin. His face had gone pale. Not angry. Not embarrassed in the shallow way people are embarrassed when caught. Pale with recognition. He was finally understanding that what he had mocked as symbolic had a face. A family. A life. The general waited until the applause softened. Then he spoke again. "There are people who believe service is only service when it is visible." His gaze moved across the room. "There are people who believe sacrifice only matters when it comes with a title, a paycheck, or a promotion." Kevin stared straight ahead. "But America has always depended on another kind of service." The general's voice became firm. "The kind performed by people who may never stand on a stage. The kind offered without applause. The kind that asks for nothing except the chance to help." He turned toward me. "Mrs. Carter did not save my life because she wanted recognition." A faint smile crossed his face. "In fact, she has made it very clear she would prefer less of it." A warm laugh moved through the room. I gave him a look. He ignored it completely. "But today we recognize her because her quiet choice gave my wife her husband back." His voice softened. "It gave my children their father back." He paused. "And it gave me 23 years I was not promised." This time I couldn't hold back the tears. They came silently. No sobbing. No drama. Just the kind of tears that finally rise when the heart understands something the mind has spent years keeping simple. General Whitaker stepped down from the podium. An aide handed him a framed certificate and a civilian service medal. He stood before me. "Mrs. Carter." He said, voice low enough that only those near us could hear, "On behalf of my family, my command, and every life touched by the years I was given, thank you." He placed the medal gently around my neck. Then, breaking every formal expectation in the room, he hugged me. A 4-star general hugged a retired reservist in front of an auditorium full of people. And nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Because everyone understood. Sometimes rank matters. Sometimes protocol matters. And sometimes gratitude is bigger than both. When he stepped back, the applause returned. But through the sound, I heard something else. Susan crying softly. Emily whispering, "I'm so proud of you." And Kevin saying nothing at all. For once, nothing was exactly what he needed to say, because the truth had finally spoken louder than he ever had. The applause did not end all at once. It faded in waves. First, the back rows settled. Then the uniformed officers returned to their seats. Then the veterans lowered their hands from their hearts. But I remained standing for a moment longer because General Whitaker still held my hand. He leaned close enough that only I could hear him. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you gave my family years we can never repay." I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything." His smile was tired, gentle, and deeply human. "That's what people like you always say." Before I could answer, he stepped aside and guided me back toward my seat. Emily was still wiping her face. Susan looked as if someone had quietly opened a locked room inside her heart. Kevin sat motionless. He did not look at me. He did not look at General Whitaker. He looked at the floor between his shoes. The ceremony continued, but I barely heard the next speaker. A physician from the blood program spoke about rare donors. A Navy nurse told a story about emergency readiness. Several other service members were recognized. All of it mattered. But my mind kept returning to one simple thought. I had spent 23 years believing my donations ended when I walked out of the clinic. Now I understood they had continued moving through the world without me. Through a husband returning home. Through children growing up with their father. Through soldiers led by a man who might not have survived. Through grandchildren who existed because a family was not broken too early. That is the strange thing about kindness. You release it from your hands and it travels farther than you ever could. After the ceremony, people formed a line. I had never enjoyed receiving attention, but I tried to be gracious. A retired corpsman shook my hand and said, "Ma'am, you reminded me why I stayed in medicine." A young sailor told me he had signed up to donate blood that morning. A woman about my age hugged me and whispered, "My husband survived because someone donated too." Every story seemed connected to another story. Every hand held a life I did not know. Near the back of the auditorium, I saw Kevin still standing alone. Susan stood beside him, speaking softly. He nodded once, then twice. Finally, he looked up and walked toward me. For years, Kevin had entered rooms as if he already owned the conclusion. That afternoon, he approached like a man who had misplaced his certainty. He stopped a few feet away. "Mom," one word. But it mattered. He had not called me that in a long time. Susan's eyes filled again. I waited. Kevin swallowed. "I owe you an apology." I looked at him carefully. "For what?" He nodded as if he knew I would ask. "For the emails." Silence. "For the comments." Another pause. "For treating what you did like it was small." His voice cracked on the last word. I did not rush to comfort him. Some regret needs room to breathe. He looked toward the stage where General Whitaker was speaking with Patricia, his wife. "I thought if something didn't come with money or status, it wasn't valuable." He gave a humorless laugh. "That's a foolish thing to say out loud." "It was a foolish thing to believe quietly, too," I said. He looked at me then. For one second, he seemed surprised by the firmness in my voice. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." That almost made me smile. Not because he sounded submissive, because he sounded awake. Susan touched his arm. Kevin continued, "I embarrassed you." "Yes." "I hurt you." "Yes." He took that without defending himself. That was new. Then he said, "And I hurt Susan by making her choose silence." Susan lowered her eyes. That was the sentence that mattered most. Because forgiveness in families is not only about the person who speaks cruelly, it is also about the quiet people who learn to shrink around cruelty. I looked at my daughter. "Susan," she stepped closer. "I should have said something sooner," she whispered. I reached for her hand. "Yes, you should have." Her tears spilled over. "But I understand why you didn't." That was the truth. Understanding does not erase accountability, but it does make healing possible. Kevin looked back at me. "I don't expect you to forget it." "I won't." He nodded. "I don't expect you to pretend it didn't happen." "I won't do that either." His eyes reddened. "But I'd like to do better." I studied him for a long moment. He was 52 years old enough to know better, young enough perhaps to change. Finally, I said, "Then start by listening more than you explain." He gave a small humbled smile. "I can do that." "And sign up to donate blood." His eyebrows lifted. Emily, standing beside me, let out a surprised laugh. Kevin blinked. Then, for the first time all day, he smiled in a way that reached his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." 3 weeks later, he did. I know because Susan sent me a photograph of Kevin sitting in a donor chair with a bright red bandage on his arm, looking mildly terrified. Under the picture, she wrote, "He nearly fainted, but he did it." I laughed so hard Tom's old clock on the mantel seemed to laugh with me. Life did not become perfect after that. Families do not heal like movie endings. Kevin still had pride to wrestle with. Susan still had old habits of smoothing over conflict. I still had moments when I remembered certain words and felt the sting return. But something had shifted. Respect entered the room. And once respect enters, real conversation can finally begin. Over the next year, General Whitaker and Patricia became part of my life in a quiet, unexpected way. Not celebrities. Not powerful people. Just friends. They invited me to dinner one Sunday afternoon. Patricia met me at the door and hugged me before I could even set down the pie I had brought. Then she cried. Then I cried. Then General Whitaker stood behind her holding napkins like a man prepared for battle. Their grandchildren called me Mrs. Carter at first. By dessert, the youngest asked if he could call me Miss Margaret. I told him that would suit me just fine. Patricia showed me family photographs from the years after his recovery. Graduations, holidays, a wedding, a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. Ordinary photographs, the most precious kind. I held one picture of General Whitaker dancing with his daughter at her wedding. For a moment I could not speak. Patricia sat beside me. "You were there," she said softly. I shook my head. "No, I wasn't." "Yes, you were." And in a way she was right. I had been there in the extra years, in the second chances, in the birthdays that almost became memorial days. That understanding changed me. Not because I felt important, because I finally understood that no good act is ever as small as it looks. A few months later, Emily called. "Grandma, guess what I did today?" "You bought more shoes." Rude. Accurate? A little, but no. I smiled. "What did you do?" "I donated blood." I sat down in the kitchen chair. For some reason, that simple sentence moved me more than the medal ever had. "Were you nervous?" "Terrified." "Did you do it anyway?" "Yes." "Then I'm proud of you." She grew quiet. I kept thinking, maybe I'll never know who it helps. Probably not. That used to bother me. And now I think that's kind of beautiful. I looked out the kitchen window toward the rose bushes Tom had planted years earlier. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, "it is." That became the real legacy of the ceremony. Not the certificate hanging in my hallway. Not the photograph of a general placing a medal around my neck. Not even Kevin's apology, though I valued it. The real legacy was what happened afterward. Emily donated again. Kevin did too, though he still complained about the needle. Susan began volunteering twice a month at the Veterans Hospital. Several younger sailors who attended the ceremony joined the rare donor registry. One quiet act had finally become visible, and because it became visible, other people chose to act. That is the kind of revenge I can live with. Not revenge that destroys, revenge that reveals. Revenge that takes what someone mocked and lets the truth stand in full daylight. At 66, I have learned that dignity does not require shouting. Sometimes dignity is showing up for 23 years without applause. Sometimes justice is watching the right people finally understand what they dismissed. And sometimes healing begins when the person who hurt you sits in a donor chair pale as paper trying to become better. I still donate when they call. Less often now. My doctor keeps a closer eye on me than I would prefer. But when the phone rings and they say there is a need, I still feel the same quiet pull. Somewhere someone is waiting. Someone's husband. Someone's mother. Someone's child. Someone's future. And I may never know their name. That's all right. I don't need to. If this story has stayed with you, I hope it reminds you of someone in your own life who quietly showed up without asking for credit. Maybe a parent, a teacher, a nurse, a neighbor, a veteran. Maybe it was you. And if there is someone you have forgotten to thank, perhaps today is a good day to tell them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes small kindness doesn't matter. And if you'd like to hear more stories about dignity, family service, and the quiet strength ordinary people carry, I would be honored to have you join us again. Because sometimes the most powerful lives are not the loudest ones. They are simply the ones that keep showing up.